We are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Carlos Martinez, who's a co-founder of the No Cold War campaign, also runs the Invent the Future blog, and is the author of The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse. I had to shout that out. It's a great book. Carlos, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, guys. Good to see you.
Very good to see you as well. Now, one of the big things that we've seen in geopolitics is Meng Wanzhou, who, of course, was the CFO, I believe, of Huawei, who was arrested in Canada on an extradition to the United States for allegedly violating U.S.-Iran sanctions. So just the skipping theory of countries says something in and of itself. But of course, she was able to return to China after the deferred prosecution agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice. I'm curious if you think, Carlos, that this is perhaps, I don't even really know how to frame it, maybe this is too, but a step back to some degree. I mean, this case was such at the center of the ratcheting up of tensions between the U.S. and China, between Canada and China. Does this resolution of the case give you some hope that perhaps the inexorable march towards Cold War may not be so inexorable?
Yeah, I think the main way that I would frame it is basically as a remarkable victory. China showed that it wouldn't be pushed around on this. Meng Wanzhou's detention was an act of blackmail, right? Of aggression. It was an act of, as you say, of a new Cold War. The US was trying to make this statement that Chinese companies need to get in line with US hegemonism, with their long-arm jurisdiction, because if not, this is what will happen. Chinese companies can't get too big. They can't compete in the global marketplace. They can't become leaders in science and technology, because if they do, we'll bully them. We'll literally arrest, detain, essentially kidnap senior executives, like you say, the CFO of Huawei. Imagine if something like that happened to the CFO of Google or of Microsoft. I mean, it's inconceivable. You can't even really think about it. But China didn't back down. It hasn't made any significant concessions. The lawyers fought a very strong case. China did the necessary work at the diplomatic level. There was, an active freedom campaign within Canada that took this fight to the court of public opinion, if you will. And then obviously the matter was taken up by the Chinese team in the recent negotiations with the US. We've heard reported that Xi Jinping raised the issue with Biden on their recent phone call. So there was this kind of multi-dimensional struggle for Meng's release. And it was successful. And that's great. It's like a rare example of a country standing up to the US's bullying, to the US's unilateralism, to the US's coercion, and winning. And ultimately, it's kind of a sign that China's strong enough now that it's not going to be pushed around. Like, these aren't the opium wars anymore. It's not the century of humiliation anymore. And nor is it even the 1980s and 1990s, where China had adopted a foreign policy based more or less around the Deng Xiaoping edict of we hide our strength and we bide our time, and basically largely staying quiet in order for China to develop the space that it needed to develop, which was fine, and I think was probably an appropriate foreign policy for China at that time. But now we're seeing a more assertive China, and that's a positive thing, not just for China, but actually, I think, for the people of the whole world, and particularly the global South, particularly the developing world, particularly those countries that aren't willing to go along with imperialist diktat, with this US-led world order. It's great for Iran if China can win these victories. It's great for Venezuela or Nicaragua or Cuba or Russia or Bolivia or Zimbabwe or North Korea or Vietnam, because these countries are also victims of the same type of hegemonism, this attempt by the US to impose its will on the world. And actually these countries, some of them are facing exactly the same type of kidnapping tactics. You've got Alex Saab, the Venezuelan diplomat that's been kidnapped in Cabo Verde and faces extradition to the US. You've got Moon Chol-myong, the North Korean businessman who's been kidnapped in Malaysia and faces extradition to the US. And that's why you've got people like Felix Plasencia, who's the Venezuelan foreign minister, who's responded like ecstatically to Meng Wanzhou's release, saying, the Venezuelan side is we're inspired, we're gratified by the firm chance the firm stance that China has taken, because there's this obvious parallel to the Alex Saab case and more generally Venezuela's own problems struggling against US imperialist attacks. So, I think Meng's release, more than anything, represents a certain shift in international relations, which is coming together and coalescing. And there's numerous countries involved in that. And I think that relates a little bit to something that we talked about before, the formation of the Group of the Friends in Defense of the US Charter, the UN Charter, which was announced earlier this year, which is a network of, I think, 17 or so countries that are just pushing to return to a basic framework of international law, to promote the UN Charter, to get to a system of multilateralism and end these unilateral coercive measures and arbitrary punitive actions that are routinely taken by the US under the banner of a so-called rules-based international order. So yeah, the way I would frame it is that the release of Meng Wanzhou is an important victory for all of progressive humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Carlos, I'm curious, we're told the official story is that she was detained over a sanctions violation that had to do with Iran, right? That's the official story. However, this was an executive from Huawei, which is a company that the US has been trying to punish, trying to sort of like destroy the business because it's just so widespread around the world. Huawei technology, you don't see it in the US. I don't even think that a Huawei phone in the US would work at this point, but they're very good phones. It's very good technology. It's much cheaper than the iPhone. So it's much more accessible to people in the developing world. There's Huawei phones all over Lebanon that are very cheap. Most people have them here. I've seen them a lot in Iraq, in my time there, a lot in Syria, and even in Europe for that matter. So I'm curious, what do you think that this was really about? Like, do you think it was really about the sanctions violation, or was that just an excuse for like a broader sort of war on Chinese technology?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of aspects to it. I mean, sanctions come into it because the US does want to maintain this long-arm jurisdiction. They want to be able to impose their unilateral sanctions globally. But actually, from a legal standpoint, Meng's detention was a farce. There's no basis for it in international law whatsoever. Under international law, you can only extradite someone when the crime that they're accused of is also in a crime in the country that they're traveling through. But circumventing US sanctions on Iran is not a crime in Canada, or indeed any other country Meng had been in. Furthermore, this charge against Meng relates, as you say, to unilateral sanctions that were imposed by the US on Iran. Those sanctions themselves are literally illegal. There's only, according to the UN, sanctions can only be imposed by one body and one body alone, which is the UN Security Council. So there's no reasonable legal basis to Meng's detention. Of course, the US wants to impose its sanctions, and that's part of it. The fact that China has very good bilateral trading relations with Iran is a problem, in the same way that in the Alex Saab case, the fact that Venezuela has very good bilateral trading relations with Iran is a problem. But also, as you say, the US is trying to send a message in relation to what it considers acceptable from a country like China and from a company like Huawei. Actually, Huawei providing cheap phones, the US can probably live with. When the US was really happy with China, China was producing cheap T-shirts in factories in Guangdong, right? That was the 80s and 90s, when China was very much at the bottom of the value chain in terms of globalized capitalism. But it was never China's plan to stay at that level. China's absorbed all these lessons in management, in science and technology. It's become a major economic power in its own right. In purchasing power parity terms, it's clearly the biggest economy in the world. It's going to continue growing. Its living standards are increasingly very good. Its life expectancy is 77, same as the US, with the significant difference that in China, it's still going up, and in the US, it's going down. So increasingly, China looks like, China has been defined as the strategic competitor now. So US foreign policy is anti-China. And therefore, for Huawei to emerge as a company that can not just produce hundreds of millions of cheap and good quality phones, but can actually be leading the world in terms of its 5G infrastructure, and now on the horizon is 6G as well, that is doing extremely well in supercomputing, is doing extremely well in AI. That's what the US can't live with. The US has relied on being considered for decades as the leading technological power, and China threatens that. And I think that's the core reason for the attack on Huawei.
I think that's a really important issue on a couple different fronts. Sorry, Ron, did I cut you off?
No, go ahead.
Well, one of the other interesting elements of just watching it, Carlos, that I've noticed is the response. I mean, certainly we see from Meng Wanzhou herself thanking the Communist Party, but also just sort of seeing comments from Chinese citizens themselves about how it reaffirmed for them the role of the party as backing up not only the values of the country, but caring about its citizens. And to me, it was an interesting note because, of course, in the United States, I'm sure in the UK as well, the Communist Party is the boogeyman of all boogeyman. It is only being presented in the darkest, most sort of Dr. Death kind of light. And this was just a very different window into how Chinese people see the role of the Communist Party in the country. And that, to me, seems notable for people who really want to understand, what's going on in China.
Yeah, I mean, Chinese people are clearly exceedingly happy about Meng's release. And I'm sure you saw the footage from Shenzhen Bao'an Airport when literally thousands of people came to the airport to welcome home, a business executive, a CFO of a company. But these thousands of people have come out, and they're clearly extremely happy, extremely emotional. You've got tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions tuned in and watching on TV. And I think people recognize that, there's a national pride, and people recognize that the CPC government has stood up and it's defended China's national pride, because people recognize that Meng's detention was a form of bullying. It was a form of coercion, right? It's part of a program to suppress China's rise. And suppressing China's rise means something quite specific and quite tangible for Chinese people, because it means stopping Chinese people from living better, from having a better standard of living, from being able to study or to be able to pursue meaningful careers or travel widely and experience a rich cultural life and so on, to move out of relative poverty and towards a prosperous, advanced socialism. That's China's trajectory, and the West is trying to stop it. And to a lot of Chinese people who've got a fairly long historical memory, that's a reminder of the century of humiliation, a reminder of that 100 years of foreign domination during which China suffered untold oppression, untold misery. So China's line is, we're building our society, life is improving, we're trying to actively contribute towards a better planet. We're, in terms of tackling climate change, in terms of containing the pandemic, in terms of building a multipolar world order, in terms of helping other developing countries and so on. And that doesn't negatively impact you in the West. We're not waging wars, we're not imposing sanctions, we're not engineering regime change operations. So what makes you think you've got the right to suppress our rise, to prevent our national rejuvenation? And I think Chinese people really understand that dynamic. They see the basic imperialist dynamic that lies behind this relationship and lies behind this bullying and these attacks. And they appreciate that their government's doing something.
We have a super chat here from a little bit, Olu Odafin, shout out to you. But asking a question, Carlos, that I think is an important question because this is being massively promoted in the Western media, asking, do you think China is going to invade Taiwan? Now, of course, the so-called warlike nature of the Chinese government is so constantly promoted, and there's so many stories like this. So I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, well, like you say, that's a story that's very much being hyped up in order to prevent this kind of truculent, belligerent China that wants to spread its authoritarian nature across the waters. I think it's very unlikely that China's going to invade Taiwan. From a military point of view, it would be, it wouldn't seem to make sense when what needs to happen is for a calming of the new Cold War. There's a US-led militarization of the Pacific, US-led militarization of the region in general. China is strongly promoting demilitarization of the region. And, people accuse China of being an aggressive power and of developing new weapons and increasing its military capacity and all the rest of it. But it's the US that's just passed the biggest military budget in history, $750 billion for 1 year. Everyone's going on about how great the infrastructure bill is, that you'd get $3.5 trillion potentially over 10 years, which is $350 billion in 1 year. So that's half. Biden's willing to spend half on meeting the basic needs of the American people compared to what he's willing to spend on warfare and aggression. That 750 billion is more than the next 10 countries put together in terms of their military budget. China spends 1/3 of that, in spite of having 4 times the population, in spite of having literally 14 borders, in spite of facing this campaign of encirclement, facing this campaign of containment. China needs to defend itself. China is very genuinely under threat. The US very genuinely isn't. It's the US that creates the threats. So as to Taiwan, of course, China will adhere to the one China principle. China's not going to give up on the idea of Taiwan being part of China. Taiwan is part of China, and that's recognized at the international level. That's recognized at the UN level, all right? And the vast majority of the countries in the world, including the United States of America, recognize the one China principle. So the US, as part of its militarization campaign, as part of escalating tensions in the region, as part of its new Cold War, is trying to increase tensions, and part of that is increasing its supply of weapons to Taiwan, and part of that is encouraging pro-independence separatist forces in Taiwan. I think it's playing, a stupid game at a time when the US would really benefit, even just in terms of its cold, calculated, basic economic sense. It needs to improve its relations with China, rather than escalating in relation to Taiwan, escalating in relation to Hong Kong, escalating in relation to Japan, escalating in relation to Xinjiang. Everywhere the US is escalating, but it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense for US capitalism. It doesn't make any sense for the US population. The only fraction, the only little section of society that this new Cold War makes sense for, and that this militarization and this rise in this escalation and rise in tensions make sense for, is the military-industrial complex, which is, essentially a tiny, tiny number of people. It's a small fraction of the population. So, the rest of the world and the developing world and the global South in particular are really waiting for the American people and the people in Europe and the people in Canada and the people in Australia to stand up to their governments and say, this new Cold War is doing nothing for us. Put a stop to it.
Well, you are with the
Carlos,
No Cold War campaign. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Rania.
I just wanted to ask one question that I think would be good to end on, if time will allow. And that is, with this taking place, with China sort of defeating this capture of one of their executives, this is also happening in parallel with, I think, the rise of these kinds of new partnerships and coalitions that we're seeing rise in the past few years, with the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter, which you mentioned, these 17 UN member states, many of whom are on the State Department hit list that are just trying to promote multilateralism and diplomacy, with China sort of being the leader of that group just because of its sheer numbers and power. You have things like the Shanghai Cooperation Council. You have more ties and trade taking place between countries like Iran and Venezuela, for example, simply because they're under U.S. sanction. I mean, these countries don't really have any other reason to be trading their oil beyond, they're on completely opposite sides of the world, other than the fact that the U.S. has sanctioned their petroleum industries and they need each other. So I'm just curious, do you think that, we're sort of in this new era of the U.S. is obviously still the biggest power in the world, is still a massive military. I'm not suggesting it isn't. But that said, there are increasingly countries led by China that are capable of challenging that power in a very tangible way.
Well, I'm not a fortune teller, and I don't want to make predictions about what the future of world politics looks like. I strongly feel that that's the trajectory of humanity, is towards multipolarity, right, or a pluripolarity, whatever you want to call it, towards a much more equal, a much more peaceful, a much more democratic and a balanced system of international relations, where you have multiple, relatively strong powers and blocks, which would include China, which would include the US, which would include the EU, which would include the African Union, which would include ASEAN and Russia and Latin America and so forth. And in terms of the sort of institutional and legal basis for that, that exists in terms of the UN and the UN Charter. We have a legal framework that can support this type of society, a multipolar society, and this is why you have groups like the Group of Friends in support of the UN in defense of the UN Charter, is because we're saying this is what we want to get back to. What we don't want is what the US and what Britain and what Canada and Australia keep pushing, is this idea of a rules-based international order, because that means the US's rules. That means wars, regime change, sanctions, blackmail, economic warfare and coercion, kidnapping, extradition, etc., in support of a political and economic order that is defined around the interests of the US and its allies, right? So we're saying we don't want that. That's unipolarity. We've had enough of that. That's been the basis of the global system of international relations for decades now, and we want to shift back towards a multipolar world order based in the United Nations, where you can't wage war without the authority of the UN Security Council. You can't impose sanctions without the authority of the UN Security Council. You can't go around engaging in regime change. You can't act as the US does act, as the policeman of the world. That's the direction we need to move in.
It's amazing how reasonable that sounds, I have to say.
It's extremely reasonable.
I don't know, it sounds pretty hard. It sounds horrible to me. I mean, are you trying to suggest that a world where the US isn't the dictator is okay? Could possibly be more peaceful?
All I'd say is that most of the world supports that. Most of the world wants that. If you ask the average person in China, do they want that? Or you ask the average person in Iraq or Iran or Zimbabwe or South Africa or Mozambique or Gambia or Ghana or Nicaragua or Cuba or Venezuela or Brazil or Russia, do you want a multipolar world? They would say yes.
Yeah.
Where this movement for a new world is still very weak is in the West. It's in Europe, right. It's in North America, it's in Australia. So that's for us to take care of, right? That's our job, to build that movement.
Absolutely. Well, Carlos Martinez with the No Cold War campaign, among many other things. Really appreciate you joining us here again on the Freedom Side.
Great to see you guys. Thank you.
Absolutely.